Close your eyes for a moment. Can you hear the sharp, rhythmic ringing of a heavy metal bicycle bell cutting through a frosty morning? Can you smell the thick, smoky scent of burning coal hanging in the narrow alleyways? Welcome back to the 1960s and 1970s. Today, we are taking a deeply emotional journey back to a time when life was vastly different. We are going to uncover 20 incredible details of everyday life that most of the modern world has forgotten, but that live forever in our hearts. Stay with me until the very end, because our final memory, involving just a fragile piece of thin paper, might just bring a tear to your eye. Let us set the scene and remember how it really felt to live back then. Time simply flowed differently in those days. It was slower, heavier, and completely free of the frantic, endless rushing of the modern world. Waiting was not an inconvenience. It was a fundamental virtue. We waited in line for fresh water, we waited months for new clothes, and we waited long weeks for a single letter to arrive. Some young people today might look at the faded, black-and-white photographs of that era and think we lived in poverty. But they do not understand the immense emotional wealth we possessed. Without glowing screens to distract us, we looked directly into each other's eyes. We relied on our neighbors not just for company, but for our very survival. Every single object we owned was maintained with extreme care, and every human connection was cherished deeply. Life was physically demanding, yes, but it was incredibly rich in absolute sincerity and love. Let us travel back to a time when survival and daily bread depended on tiny, fragile slips of paper. I am talking, of course, about the food ration coupons, those precious little tickets we called liang piao. If you lived through the 1960s, you know that money alone could not buy your dinner. You needed these small rectangles, printed with intricate borders and careful calligraphy, to buy rice, flour, oil, or even cloth. Do you remember the texture of that thin paper? It was often worn soft at the edges from being counted and recounted by anxious mothers. I remember how my mother would keep them in a special hidden pocket or a small tin box, treating them with the reverence of absolute treasure. When she handed you a coupon to go to the grain store, you held it so tightly your knuckles turned white, terrified of dropping it in the dirt. At the store, you would hand over the ticket, and the clerk would weigh out the grain with a heavy steelyard balance. There was a profound sense of responsibility in that exchange. We learned early on that everything was measured, everything was precious, and nothing could ever be wasted. And now, let us recall the absolute pride of the neighborhood, the magnificent black bicycle. In those days, owning a flying pigeon or a phoenix bicycle was a monumental achievement for any family. It was not just a way to get around, it was a symbol of hard work and stability. Can you still hear the crisp, sharp ringing of the metal bell, or the steady rhythmic clicking of the chain as your father pedaled down the street? The frame was heavy, solid black, with shining chrome handlebars that caught the morning sun. If you were a child, your special place was sitting on the cold metal crossbar, wrapped in your father's arms as he steered through the crowded alleyways. You felt so safe, so elevated above the world. On Sundays, cleaning the bicycle was an almost sacred ritual. Fathers would take a soft cotton rag and carefully polish every single spoke until it gleamed. We would oil the chain and check the tires with our thumbs. When a family finally saved enough to buy one, all the neighbors would come out to admire it, running their hands over the leather seat. It was a vehicle of dreams, carrying families toward a better, brighter future together. Let us take a moment to remember the towering, magnificent piles of winter cabbage. If you lived in the northern provinces during the 1960s and 1970s, you surely remember the great cabbage fever that swept through every street and courtyard as November approached. The air would grow crisp, and suddenly horse-drawn carts and flatbed tricycles would arrive, overflowing with fresh green and white heads of cabbage. Buying cabbage was not just a chore. It was an absolute family mobilization. Families would buy hundreds of pounds at once to last the entire winter. Do you remember the earthy, slightly sweet smell of those fresh leaves? We would carefully lay them out in the sun on the sidewalks, turning them gently so they would dry just right without freezing. Then came the great stacking in the hallways, on balconies, or right under the eaves. Walking home from school, you had to navigate through narrow corridors lined with these green mountains. Every meal seemed to feature cabbage, boiled cabbage, stir-fried cabbage, cabbage in dumplings. Yet somehow, when Mother cooked it with a few drops of precious oil, it tasted like an absolute feast that kept the winter cold at bay. Next, let us wander back to the dusty street corners of our childhood, where a whole universe of imagination could be rented for just one single fen. I'm talking about the palm-sized comic books, the beloved Xiao Ren Shu. Do you remember the sight of those little wooden stalls? The vendor would lay out dozens of these tiny rectangular books on a large cloth or a sloping wooden board. After school, we would run there, clutching our tiny copper coins, our hearts racing with anticipation. You would hand over your coin and pick a book, then sit right there on a tiny, wobbly wooden stool among a dozen other silent, captivated children. The smell of that cheap, porous paper, often damp and smelling faintly of ink and dust, is something I will never forget. The pages were dog-eared and soft from hundreds of eager hands turning them. We followed the adventures of heroes, generals, and mythical monkeys, completely lost in the beautiful black and white line drawings. We did not own these books. We shared them, passing the stories from hand to hand. It was our cinema, our library, and our greatest escape, all contained in a little book that perfectly fit into the palm of a child's hand. Do you remember the sea of green that filled our streets and schools? Let us think back to the plain green army uniforms that almost everyone wore with such immense pride. In those days, fashion was not about standing out with bright colors or strange cuts. It was about belonging to a shared ideal. The ultimate dream for any young person was to have a genuine set of green clothes, complete with a matching soft cap. Do you remember the texture of that thick, sturdy cotton? When it was new, it was stiff and vibrant, but as the months and years passed, it faded into a soft, comfortable shade of pale olive. We wore those clothes until they literally fell apart. Mothers would spend their evenings carefully patching the elbows and the knees with whatever scraps of matching cloth they could find. You could tell a lot about a person's life by the pattern of the men's on their green jacket. There was a unique rustling sound when you walked in those thick trousers, a sound of resilience and unity. We did not feel poor because we all looked the same. We felt like a giant, unified family, marching together in our faded green clothes through the trials of the decade. Let us pause and listen to the music of the courtyard before a great festival. Can you hear the rhythmic, thunderous sound of heavy metal cleavers chopping meat and vegetables on thick wooden blocks? The ritual of making dumplings, of bao jiao zi, was the beating heart of family life. It was never a silent or solitary task. The preparation began hours in advance. The sound would start in one house, then another would join in, until the entire alleyway was filled with this beautiful, chaotic symphony of chopping. The smell of fresh ginger, scallions, and soy sauce would drift through the open windows, making everyone's mouth water. The entire family would gather around a large round table. One person would roll the dough into perfect, translucent little circles. Another would scoop the filling, and another would pinch the edges shut. Do you remember the flour dusting your mother's nose as she laughed? We talked, we joked, and we shared the stories of our week. The dumplings were not just food. They were tiny pouches of love, shaped like ancient silver ingots to bring good fortune. Eating that first hot dumpling, dipped in dark vinegar, was the taste of pure, unadulterated happiness. And now, let us cast our minds up to the wooden poles standing high above the village or the factory yard. I want to talk about the community loudspeakers, those giant metal horns that dictated the rhythm of our entire existence. In the 1960s and 70s, you did not need an alarm clock. You were awakened by the sharp crackle of static, followed instantly by the blaring, energetic notes of a marching song. The sound was metallic, echoing, and it reached every single corner of the neighborhood. Do you remember the voice of the local broadcaster? It was always crisp, loud, and full of authority. They would read the morning news, announce the work quotas for the day, and sometimes even call out lost children or announce a neighborhood meeting. During the morning exercises, we would all stand in the yard, moving our arms and legs in perfect synchronization with the counting voice from the sky. Those loudspeakers were the voice of our community. They tied our individual lives to the grand, sweeping movements of the whole country. When the speaker finally crackled and went silent in the evening, the sudden quiet was the official signal that the day of hard labor was finally done. Let us take a sweet journey back to the freezing winter afternoons and remember the magical call of the street vendor selling candied hawthorn, the beloved tanghulu. When the bitter north wind howled through the leafless trees, the sudden cry of the vendor would bring all the children running out of their courtyards. Do you remember the sight of that tall straw pole, heavily loaded with skewers of bright, ruby-red berries? They looked like precious jewels sparkling in the pale winter sun. The vendor carried that heavy pole on his shoulder, bringing joy to every street he walked down. You would hand over your few coins, and he would carefully pull out a skewer for you. The first bite was an unforgettable sensory explosion. There was the sharp, shattering crack of the hard, translucent sugar coating breaking against your teeth. It was incredibly sweet, but immediately followed by the intense, mouth-watering sourness of the soft hawthorn berry inside. The combination of the icy cold sugar and the soft fruit was the ultimate winter treat. It was a simple joy, a burst of bright color and intense flavor that made the long, harsh, and gray winters feel like a wonderful celebration. Now let us wrap our hands around the memories of those sturdy, indestructible enamel mugs. In those days, every household, every factory desk, and every schoolroom had them. They were usually a creamy white, decorated with bright red peonies, swimming carp, or bold red characters bearing inspirational slogans. Do you remember the satisfying, heavy clink they made when you set them down on a wooden table? These mugs went through life with us. They were dropped on concrete floors, banged against sinks, and taken on long train journeys. And with every drop, a tiny piece of the shiny white enamel would chip away, revealing the dark, rough iron beneath. We never threw them away. Those chips and black spots became badges of honor, a map of the mug's history. In the freezing winter months, wrapping your freezing fingers around a mug filled to the brim with boiling hot water was the best way to keep warm. You would blow on the surface, squinting through the rising steam, and take small, careful sips. That simple enamel mug was a symbol of our endurance, battered and bruised by the passing years, but remaining strong, useful, and absolutely essential to our daily survival. Let us step into the quiet of the late evening and listen to the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of the home. I am speaking of the hand-cranked or treadle sewing machines, like the famous Butterfly brand, that sat proudly in the corner of our rooms. Before the era of cheap, ready-made clothing, mothers were the true architects of our wardrobes. Do you remember the hypnotic sound of the needle punching through fabric? Clack, 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 it went, a steady rhythm that often lulled us to sleep. The machine was a heavy piece of cast iron, black and beautifully decorated with golden decals of flowers or birds. I can still recall the distinct smell of the clear machine oil used to keep the gears running smoothly. Under the dim yellow glow of a single, incandescent bulb, mothers would work long into the night, turning old, worn-out adult trousers into warm winter jackets for the children. They measured, cut, and sewed with intense concentration, their feet rocking endlessly on the metal pedal. That sewing machine was an engine of love. Every stitch it made was a silent promise from our parents that, despite the hardships, we would always be clothed, warm, and deeply cared for. Do you remember the weight of the water buckets pulling at your shoulders? Let us recall the daily journey to the neighborhood water station or the communal tap in the courtyard. Running water inside the house was a luxury most of us did not know. Instead, fetching water was a daily ritual, a chore that doubled as the social center of the community. You would grab your buckets, made of heavy wood or clanking tin, and walk to the public tap. I remember the sound of the water splashing onto the stone pavement, which was always covered in bright green moss in the summer, and dangerously slick with thick ice in the winter. Waiting in line was never boring. The water tap was where you heard the latest news, where grandmothers traded cooking secrets, and where arguments were settled. It was a place of deep human connection. You had to have strength to carry those 2 buckets back home, balancing them carefully so the precious water would not spill over the sides and wet your cloth shoes. We learned exactly how much water was needed to wash a face, boil tea, and cook rice. It taught us a profound respect for resources, a lesson that was carried in every aching muscle of our arms. Let us turn our memories to the magic of the warm summer nights and the incredible excitement of the open-air cinema. When news spread that a projectionist was coming to the village square or the factory field, the anticipation was electric. Hours before dusk, children would be sent ahead with small, wobbly wooden stools or woven mats to claim the best spot in front of the giant white sheet hung between 2 trees. Do you remember the moment it finally got dark? The loud whirring sound of the heavy metal projector would start, and a brilliant beam of light would cut through the thick summer air. We would watch in absolute awe as the dust motes and thousands of tiny moths danced inside that beam of light. The audio was always scratchy, blasting from a solitary horn speaker, but nobody cared. We sat shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of our neighbors, eating roasted sunflower seeds and swatting away mosquitoes. The stories on the screen, whether they were war heroes or revolutionary operas, transported us to another world. The open-air cinema was not just a movie, it was a grand, communal celebration of imagination under a vast canopy of glittering stars. Now let us feel the deep, comforting warmth of the Dalian Kang, the large, heated brick bed that dominated the homes in the north. Winter in those days was fiercely cold, with winds that seemed to cut right through your bones. But inside, the Kang was our sanctuary. Do you remember the smell of the burning cornstalks or coal briquettes that fueled the fire beneath the bed? The smoke would travel through the flues, heating the bricks from the inside out. When you climbed onto the kang at night, the warmth would seep directly into your chilled muscles, baking away the cold of the day. The entire family lived on that bed during the winter months. We ate our meals on a small, short-legged table placed right in the center. We did our homework there, and women sat cross-legged, knitting thick woolen sweaters. At night, we unrolled our heavy cotton quilts and slept side by side in a long row. The kang forced us to be physically close, to share the same small pocket of warmth in a freezing world. It was more than just a piece of furniture. It was the very foundation of the family structure, radiating a heat that was as much about love and unity as it was about surviving the winter. Let us remember the chaotic, joyful sounds of children playing in the streets, specifically the thrilling game of rolling iron hoops. Before the days of plastic toys and electronic screens, we made our own fun out of scraps of metal and sheer physical energy. The toy was incredibly simple, just a heavy metal ring and a thick wire rod bent into a U shape at the end. But the skill required to keep that hoop rolling was immense. Can you still hear the loud metallic clanging as the iron hoop bounced over the uneven cobblestones and dirt paths of the alleyways? We would run for hours after school, pushing the hoop faster and faster, leaning into the turns completely covered in dust and sweat. It felt like you were driving a race car. There were epic races between neighborhoods, tests of endurance and balance. Sometimes the hoop would hit a rock and wobble out of control, crashing into a neighbor's door, earning us a loud scolding. But we would just laugh, pick it up, and start running again. It was a game that required no money, only open space and a wild, boundless energy. It gave us strong legs, quick reflexes, and a childhood filled with simple, breathless joy. Let us recall an object that was absolutely central to the hospitality and comfort of every single household, the traditional thermos flask. You will surely remember the beautiful, intricate outer casing made of woven bamboo, or later, the bright metal ones painted with blooming red peonies. Hot water was the cure for everything in those days, and the thermos was its guardian. Do you remember the loud, satisfying popping sound the wooden cork made when you pulled it out? That cork, often wrapped in a bit of white cloth to make it fit snugly, held back a cloud of pure, white steam. The inside was a fragile glass vacuum liner. If you accidentally dropped the thermos, the heartbreaking sound of the glass shattering inside was a disaster for the family. Whenever a guest arrived, the very first thing you did without question or hesitation was reach for that bamboo thermos and pour a steaming cup of hot water or tea. It was the ultimate gesture of welcome and respect. The thermos stood quietly on the table, a constant source of warmth, reminding us that no matter how little we had, we could always offer a friend a cup of hot tea and a moment of genuine comfort. And now, let us breathe in the unforgettable scent of the evening, the pungent, slightly sharp smell of burning honeycomb coal briquettes. In the 1970s and 80s, these cylindrical blocks of coal dust and clay, pierced with holes to let the air through, were the absolute lifeblood of the kitchen. Making or buying them was a dirty, exhausting job. Do you remember the men pushing incredibly heavy flatbed carts loaded with hundreds of these black cylinders, their faces covered in dark soot? Storing them in the damp corners of the yard meant you always had black dust under your fingernails. But the real ritual was lighting the stove. It required immense patience. You would use old crumpled newspapers, some precious dry twigs, and a piece of burning wood to carefully ignite the bottom edge of the coal. We would stand outside, coughing as the thick, acrid yellow smoke billowed out before the coal finally caught fire and glowed a beautiful, steady cherry red. The stove cooked our rice, boiled our water, and warmed our frozen hands. That smell of coal smoke hanging heavy in the damp evening air is the true, unforgettable perfume of our childhood neighborhoods. Let us sweeten our memories with a taste that every child dreamed of, the legendary White Rabbit creamy candy. In an era when sugar was a strictly rationed luxury, receiving a piece of this candy was like being handed a tiny, wrapped piece of magic. You usually only saw them during the spring festival or at weddings. Do you remember carefully unwrapping the paper, revealing the smooth, cylindrical white candy inside? But the absolute best part, the thing that fascinated us all, was the inner wrapping. It was a thin, transparent layer of edible rice paper. I remember placing that delicate paper on my tongue and waiting in sheer wonder as it slowly dissolved into nothing. Then came the candy itself. It was hard at first, requiring patience, but slowly it would yield, filling your mouth with a rich, intense, milky sweetness that seemed to last forever. We would chew it slowly, trying to make the experience stretch out as long as physically possible. That candy was not just a dessert. It was a rare reward, a symbol of parental love, and a brief, glorious escape into a world of pure sweetness during times that were often bitter and deeply challenging. Now let us look down at our feet and remember the profound comfort of traditional, hand-stitched cloth shoes. Before rubber and plastic soles became common, mothers and grandmothers made every single pair of shoes by hand. The process was a labor of astonishing patience and love. Do you remember seeing layers and layers of old scrap fabric glued together with sticky flour paste, set out on wooden boards to dry in the sun? That was the foundation of the soul. Women would sit for hours, using a sharp metal awl to pierce the incredibly thick layers, pushing a heavy needle and thick hemp thread through with a rhythmic grunt of effort. The sound of the thread pulling tight was the soundtrack of the afternoon. When you slipped your feet into a new pair of cloth shoes, they were stiff at first, but within days they molded perfectly to the shape of your foot. They were light, breathable, and completely silent when you walked. Every single stitch, and there were thousands of them in a single pair, was a testament to a mother's fierce dedication to protecting her family. Wearing those shoes meant walking on a foundation built entirely out of maternal love. Let us gather around the memory of the summer evening dinners in the communal courtyards. Life in the big courtyards meant that the boundaries between families were wonderfully blurred. When the intense heat of the summer day finally broke, families would carry their small wooden tables and bamboo chairs out into the open air. Do you remember the buzzing chorus of the cicadas hiding in the large elm trees? We would sit outside with our bowls of noodles or rice. There were no secrets. If one family made a particularly delicious dish of braised eggplant or caught a rare fish, small bowls of it were immediately passed around to the neighbors to share. Adults would sit back with large fans woven from palm leaves, swatting at mosquitoes and discussing the news of the factory, while children ran endlessly between the tables, stealing bites of food from everyone. It was noisy, chaotic, and incredibly intimate. We did not have televisions to stare at, so we looked at each other. We listened to each other. The courtyard was our entire world, a vibrant, living ecosystem of mutual support, where nobody was ever truly lonely or left to face their troubles by themselves. Finally, let us hold in our hands the most precious, fragile connection to the people we loved. I am talking about the handwritten letters on thin grid paper. In a time before instant messages and mobile phones, communicating with relatives in the countryside or friends in distant provinces required immense patience. Do you remember the profound quiet of sitting down with a fountain pen, dipping it in dark blue ink, and carefully writing characters onto the square grids of the paper? Every word was chosen with care, because the space was limited and the postage stamp was a considered expense. And then came the waiting. You would wait weeks, listening for the bell of the postman on his green bicycle. When a letter finally arrived, it was an event. The envelope would be worn, bearing the smudged postmarks of a long, arduous journey. You could smell the distinct scent of the paper and the ink, and sometimes you could even feel the physical weight of the sender's tears or laughter in the strokes of their handwriting. Those letters were pieces of a human soul sent across thousands of miles. They taught us that true love and deep connection could absolutely survive the vastness of distance and the slow, heavy passage of time. As we look back at these 20 memories, a profound truth emerges from the shadows of the past. We do not actually miss the hardships, the strict rationing, or the bitter cold winters. What our hearts truly ache for is the pure, unfiltered feeling of our youth. We miss that era because we miss who we were when we rode those heavy black bicycles and ate those sweet candies. We miss the intense, unbreakable bonds we shared with our families and our neighbors. We miss a time when a simple cup of hot water or a hand-stitched shoe was a profound declaration of love. If this journey back in time brought warmth to your heart, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. Now, I want to ask you a question. Which of these 20 memories sparked the brightest flash of nostalgia for you? Please share your personal stories in the comments below. Let us build a beautiful monument to our shared past together.